pretty easy with just a handful of prompting techniques to automate pretty much any task. The problem is that it can only do a search of specific paragraphs. That's one of the biggest misconceptions, I think, with custom GPTs.
You're going to want to run 10 tests with one example across different models or different things you want to test, and then kind of average those out.
The thing you can do to improve a prompt is to give it examples of that task being done well.
Confabulation means when someone creates a false story from memory, but they didn't actually intend to deceive anybody.
I like to think about and sense check my prompts is based on where would it find the right type of answer on the internet.
Tell the model to adopt a certain persona. That can always work really well.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Growth Mentor Live. Today we are covering how to boost your prompt engineering game so you can get the results you have always wanted out of AI. I'm Micah McGuire, Head of Content here at GrowthMentor, and today I am joined by Mike Taylor, Prompt Engineer and O'Reilly author of Prompt Engineering for Generative AI, and Alex Lambropoulos, founder of Measurely.io. And if you have ever used GrowthMentor's AI mentor matching, thank Alex. He was the mastermind behind bringing that idea to life. Now, there will be an open Q&A during this session, so if at any point you have questions, please put those in the chat. I will be keeping an eye out for them throughout the session. And finally, yes, there will be a recording available, so if you're not able to join us for the entire session, you should have a recording in your inbox next week. All right, guys, so I think that covers all of our housekeeping. Mike, Alex, great to have you here with us today.
Yeah, good to
Great
be
to
here.
be with you.
Awesome. So we will go ahead and dive right into questions. So I am going to basically kick this one off with just a little bit of theory because I feel like we all need to have a little bit of basis in how the theory works here before we get into all the fun application stuff. But why can't most of us seem to get consistent results out of AI? Is it prompts? Is it something we're just doing horrifically wrong here? Is there something weird with the AI? What's the reasoning behind that? And Michael, I'll let you kick that one off.
Yeah, so I think it's just a feature of working with another intelligent being. Obviously, these things aren't
Really, it comes down to, I guess, a couple of things for me. One is that, just the nature of AI models themselves, they're unpredictable. The way they just automatically function is probabilistic, right? So they're looking at the input and generating a probability about, what's likely to be the best output, which is why it's not always going to be consistent. And that's why the instruction that we ultimately provide is so important. The prompting methodologies, et cetera. But also, each AI model is different. Some AI models are trained on, some parameters of data or some billions of parameters, others have less parameters of data. So depending on what you're asking also, it'll know less or it'll be less predictable what happens next.
And Michael, I think we had a little bit of lag there. Was there anything else that you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think we can mitigate the issues that we have with AI, but most of the time it's really just a failure to prompt the AI with exactly what you want. In the same way that if you hired an employee, didn't give them any direction of how you want the task to be done, didn't give them any examples of how you've done it well in the past, then they're going to do a bad job. They don't understand. They can't read your mind. A lot of the things that we do with prompt engineering to get AIs to work more reliably are very similar to the things that you would do when you're hiring an employee and you're working with them to do a good job. And it would be really crazy to hire an employee, give them no training in the task, and then complain that they can't do it. And that's what a lot of people are doing with AI.
Alrighty, awesome. So I guess the next thing is I'm sure everybody here probably has a good grasp of how AI works at the basic level, but I'm not sure if everybody is aware of all of the different models that are available. I guess what are some of the most popular ones? Alex, do you have ones to throw out?
Yeah, personally, I'm a little bit biased. I'm a little bit biased toward GPT. So I'll say this now because this will kind of over the rest of the session, but maybe Michael can be sort of balance that a little bit. But obviously there's multiple AI models out there. Facebook has their own Llama. You have Claude by Anthropic, Mistral, and AI research is constantly evolving. New models are coming out. And it's a lot to process. But I think for most use cases, they all perform pretty well. Of course, there's quality and speed always have to be balanced with them, which is really what it comes down to. Also, like specifically what you're trying to get done within them. But I would say those are probably some of the more popular ones. Not sure if Mike, you would add to that.
Yeah. So I guess I'm pretty dominantly using OpenAI's API to do prompt engineering because it is, pretty much the best model. I have found that Claude from Anthropic is worth considering in a lot of cases, and I do test out a lot of the open source models. Like one of the things I tend to do for clients is I'll start with GPT-4. As the best model that you just get the task working, and then if it works well and we want to scale it up, then you want to kind of try out other models and see if you can get it done cheaper with a dumber model, basically. And if you can kind of if once you get the task working, it can do what you need it to do. Then optimizing the prompt further to get it working on a less capable model that's faster and cheaper is like a pretty common path for people. But with a pretty smart model like OpenAI's GPT-4, and then work our way down the stack to a faster, cheaper model. So might start with OpenAI and then see if we can get it working with GPT 3.5, which is also OpenAI, but I think 20 times cheaper. Or if it works with GPT 3.5, then you can get it to work with Llama or any of the other models as well. So that's usually the path that we take. Is we start with like the best model but the most expensive, and then move to a dumber model to scale.
Okay, all right, great. And just to cover that, what Michael was saying is that basically you're starting with a more expensive model, so GPT-4, and some of the, I guess, higher velocity, I would say kind of higher octane models, and then working your way down. So are there any of these models that are more consistent than others, or is it just a matter of how the models are set up? Are there certain settings that you should be tweaking if you're looking for more consistent output?
So I'll chime in here. So I think yes, but ultimately also depends on what you want to do. So for example, GPT-4 excels at coding compared to other models. So if you're looking to generate code, you would use something like GPT-4. But like I kind of said before, quality and speed always have to be traded off when it comes to these models. And Michael also touched on, so GPT 3.5 is just so much cheaper. But the reasoning ability that you get with GPT-4, that extra, it's a little more intelligent, it's better at reasoning tasks, might be better for depending on the use case. So I think sort of testing and then looking to optimize by going to cheaper models is always a good way to approach it. Actually, these models are scored, so there's multiple ways to like score these models now based on how good they are or perceived quality. So one of these is called MMLU. Trying to remember what it stands for. Massive something language understanding. Forgot the acronym, but basically they assess these models on multiple tasks at the same time. From concepts such as remembering history or doing math or writing code, and then ultimately there's a ranking to them. This is just one method of assessing them, and there we see GPT-4 sort of excelling. But things are always changing, with these new models, and again, depending on the use case of what you're looking to do.
Okay, and that's actually a really interesting point. Are there certain tasks that certain models are better at? I know you mentioned that GPT is a little bit better at coding. Are there certain, I guess, do you two have go-to models for certain tasks is the question here.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, GPT-4 is mostly what I use. I have played around with them. Mike definitely has played around with the other models a lot more than I have. But yeah, for coding, GPT-4 has always been great. Cloud, I've heard is very good at more creative tasks. But maybe Mike, what have you seen?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that. I would say there's less deviation between, or less difference between the language models, and a much bigger difference when it comes to image generation. So Midjourney definitely has its own style, like kind of a fantasy aesthetic, although it is capable of doing pretty much anything. And then DALL-E has like this cartoonish vibe that actually don't really like, but it is very family friendly. It's great for tasks where you don't want any kind of negative or explicit stuff to pop in. Whereas, say, if you're using Stable Diffusion, which is the open source one, That one is great at creating realistic images, but it also like occasionally makes the image look explicit. So it might show a little bit extra cleavage or something, and it's because a lot of that model was trained on a lot of like I guess explicit imagery. It's part of why it's good at creating body shapes with clothes on, but occasionally with clothes off. So yeah, there's the yeah, I would say like as these models start to expand and gain different feature sets, and they go in different directions, they'll start to differentiate in terms of personality as well. You're starting to see that a little bit with text generation. So Claude feels like a bit of a warmer personality, and it is better, I think, at creative writing tasks, like Alex was saying. GPT-4 is kind of like it's more Wikipedia style, I guess, but it's better at reasoning. So you're starting to see a little bit of divergence in the text generation space, but I suspect that trend will continue as these models gain different personalities and start to get used by different sets of users. It'll start to segment the market.
That's actually a really interesting point. I never thought about the fact that what material you pre-train the models on would kind of also determine what they're good at. I mean, it makes perfect sense whenever you bring it up, but that's something I don't know that a lot of people have considered.
100%. I mean, all these models are trained, these are all generalists. They're kind of generalists right now, kind of jack of all trades, but now we're seeing models that are trained on specific tasks. So we'll see, more than likely LLM specifically for marketing or, specific verticals. Right. And that's where we'll really be able to, they would really be useful in these sort of specialist tasks.
Mm-hmm. And actually, this kind of touches on one of the sessions we actually just had last week, which was Tim Chakir gave us a session on building custom GPTs. So I can definitely see how that differentiation will probably continue, and we'll have things kind of split off and branch off. That'll be very interesting to see in the future. So if we were going to go to prompting, let's talk some of those prompting principles that can help our users get kind of consistent output. Let's maybe both you guys can throw out 1 to 2 that you think would be most useful. And Michael, I'll let you start here.
Yeah, so the number one thing you can do to improve a prompt is really just to give it examples of that task being done well. It very quickly, if you just add like 1 to 3 examples, you'll get it'll get 20% better at least, in my experience. And there's actually some scientific papers that have studied this. Actually, whenever they release a scientific paper, they talk about something new, a new model they've released. They'll evaluate based on these benchmarks. And one of the things they distinguish when they evaluate is between 0 shot and 1 shot or few shot prompting. And what they mean by that, when you hear the term 0 shot, that means it did the task, just describing the task. We didn't give it any examples. And then 1 shot is we gave it 1 example, or few shot means we gave it a few examples of the task. And the reason they differentiate them in the scientific papers is because 0 shot is very, very hard. Like giving it no context means it usually performs much worse, whereas even just giving it 3 or 4 examples can make a massive difference. So yeah, that's the biggest shift in performance you can get, but it's also relatively costly in terms of your time. So you have to go out and find good examples. So I was doing this for some product management task automation this week. I had to go out and find good examples of product requirement documents, right? And it's actually pretty hard to find on the internet. Like you can find a lot of blog posts of people writing about how to make a good product requirements document, but it's pretty hard to find, say, like a list of 10 real product requirements documents you could stuff into the prompt. So I would say, that's where your data becomes a really big advantage. Like if you're collecting data and if you're annotating the data, and if you have like a big list of, times that task has been done well in the past, then you can stuff that in the prompt and it's going to make an immediate big difference.
Okay. Now, I do want to touch on this just very quickly because I know like last week whenever we were talking custom GPTs, this required GPT plus. For this kind of doing these 1 shots, few shots prompting, is this something that you need to have some of these more advanced, I guess the paid versions of these OpenAI's? Is this something that basically you can get just with the off-the-shelf free model? You just have to do it the correct way.
Yeah, a good question. And there's a lot of confusion about what you get with Plus versus what custom GPTs are doing, etc. So adding examples to the prompt is something that anyone could do to any model. Like, it works with every single model, and
Okay.
it's literally, there's no special nature to it. It is literally, you describe your task, and then you just literally copy and paste some examples of it doing of
Okay.
that task being done into the prompt. So that works for every single model. Now there is some benefit to using the custom GPTs because you can do something called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, where instead of you just, if you think about it, say you had 1,000 examples to pick from, you could only fit 10 in the prompt. Then you might want to just select the best 10 out of those 1,000. And retrieval augmented generation, RAG, is a technique for finding, say, the 10 best examples to put into the prompt automatically. So when people are building AI systems, they usually have that as part of the process. You will ask the question, but it won't just straight answer that question back. It will go and search the database for 10 examples of that question being answered, or similar questions to yours being answered, and then it will return those answers. So then when you're getting a response, finally, the response you're getting is much better because you've given the 10-shot example, and those shots are all relevant to what you asked.
Well, one thing I wanted to add here, so 100%, I think these are all great points. And one more thing you can do, going from, let's say, 0-shot to few shot, is then when you want to go to chain of thought, when you sort of helping the model sort of reason and take it into steps. So, think about these elements and having it sort of tell you that reasoning as it's generating the output. The model will perform a lot better because, again, it's a probabilistic model, right? So it reasons, it becomes more accurate as you ask it to reason. And a great point about RAG too. Actually, I was last year I founded an AI company basically that allowed you to talk to your data. So you would connect data from GA4 and Facebook ads and Google ads, and you'd be able to ask questions on your data. And we used RAG there basically to, when you ask a question like, what was my spend yesterday, or what is my spend predicted to be tomorrow? We had, obviously many steps to get to the answer, but ultimately it came down to RAG sort of pulling for each metric I'm asking. Am I asking about spend? I'm asking about revenue. And then it would reference a table about what spend is tied to or what revenue is tied to. Ultimately, when we were thinking about metrics, we were thinking about these in sort of like a KPI tree, right? So revenue is driven by number of users and then average spend, right? So we would break these down for the model through RAG. And so the model would be able to interpret how to give you the right answer through that. So RAG is really incredible and scales really well across multiple sort of use cases.
Okay, wow, that is incredible. I think one of the things that's coming to mind for me for this is I know that AI can sometimes only hold on to a certain amount of data, essentially. So is there a certain length that people should be keeping their examples under? I guess if for example, I'm thinking of the use case if you were trying to work with content, or in my case, working with transcripts here at GrowthMentor Live, how much data can handle, essentially. Do we need to be thinking in word counts? Do we need to be thinking in basically certain ways of lines, something like that? If you're doing code, what's the best way to think about that capacity?
Yeah, so this has changed quite a bit in the past few months because it used to be a massive preoccupation. You could only fit 8,000 tokens in Chat-GPT previously, and tokens are about 3/4 of a word. It's fairly limited. Like you could do most tasks, but quite often I would find myself, hitting that ceiling with ChatGPT where it says like, sorry, you've extended the length, especially if I was doing a series of tasks all in the same chat. But now you kind of don't need to worry about it if you're using ChatGPT Plus, because you can fit 120,000 tokens, I think is the latest, and Claude is 200,000 tokens. So to put that in perspective, that's basically like a whole Harry Potter book. You can fit into the prompt, which is pretty amazing, right? So, Google actually has a model that's in preview at the minute that has 1 million tokens, which is basically the whole series of Harry Potter. So the ceiling is being lifted. So the only time you really need to worry about tokens and context window now is if you're building an AI application. So like what Alex did with GrowthMentor. In theory, you could probably stuff like every single GrowthMentor profile into the prompt, and then say which GrowthMentor to look at. But if he did that, then it's going to cost a lot of money because you pay per token. So if you're stuffing 100,000, 200,000 tokens into every prompt, you're paying like a couple of dollars per call, and the app could get very expensive pretty quickly. I actually know people who run small AI tools, and apart from themselves, like OpenAI is the most expensive employee in their company, right? Like I know people spending like $3,000-$4,000 a month just on OpenAI bills. As a small business with 1 or 2 employees. So I would say it can add up pretty quickly, especially if you're being very liberal with all the context you put into the context window. So RAG can help you bring down those costs, because instead of stuffing in every single GrowthMentor into the prompt, you could just do a search and find, what are the 10 GrowthMentors that have mentioned that they know how to solve this type of problem. Like they have an experience in SEO. So you could pull in like what are the ones that have the best experience with SEO. And you could do that. And maybe Alex could teeing Alex up maybe to talk a little bit about vector search and how that's different. But you could search by keyword, but you just like a normal search, or you could filter. Like you could filter based on structured data and say, okay, only show me mentors that have SEO tag in their bio. But you could also do similarity search with the vector database. And then that's much more flexible. You can kind of find people, even if they don't mention SEO and they call it organic search, it's still going to come up and still be relevant. So yeah, Alex, maybe do you want to explain what vector search is?
Yeah, so I mean, embeddings, right? Overall? So embeddings are super powerful. Basically, the way to think about embeddings is a representation of words into numbers in a vector space. So I think GrowthMentor is a good example of AI matching. So the way it works is you have all the mentors. These are uploaded in a CSV, right? And they exist in a vector space formed into numbers. All of their expertises, their skills, their background, their experience, the tools that they're familiar with. And then the mentee search, in this case, like I want a mentor that excels that knows product market fit and has founded these companies and knows this really well. Right. So then the mentee is kind of also a point in this multidimensional space. So you have all the mentors in the multidimensional space and then the mentee. And then the words or the numbers actually between them is actually context. Like it's understanding what they're actually, the numbers are representing the not the actual words themselves, but the meaning of the words, the context behind the words. And so that's how we're able to, the closest mentee with the closest mentor in that vector space would be a match in our case. Of course, there's a lot of other sort of things you can add there to ensure that you have a good result. But that's just one example of how embeddings can be super powerful. But even before you get to embeddings, right, just the basic prompts, you're just using Chat-GPT and you want to get better. I think just, the different sort of zero shot, few shot techniques we talked about or reasoning can be really helpful. But also then just in general, be specific. You don't usually need to say too much, right? And not just be specific, but maybe tell the model sort of to adopt a certain persona. That can always work really well. So if you're trying to solve a task that involves data analysis, you would tell them to adopt the persona of an AI data scientist, right? If it's a content marketer or you're trying to write an article, do the same thing. And then in that instruction, I guess one more thing I would add is to not to be imprecise. It's a little bit different than being specific. Not being imprecise means, be short and or don't write too many sentences, right? Actually, what you want to say there is, give me a maximum of 10 sentences. You want to be specific, and you don't actually want to tell the model what not to do, but what to do. It doesn't interpret not doing as well as doing. So those are just a few things that come top of mind when it comes to just prompting. Obviously, I covered embeddings a little bit as well.
I think your point about assigning it a role was very interesting to me. Is there a reason why that works? That's just a sheer curiosity. Is there something that's built in there? Is it just, it has a corpus of data, so it understands what these roles are, and therefore it's able to adopt them? I guess, is there...
Oh, yeah, so you just think about it as it's based on the training data. So it's trained on everything on the internet, essentially. The way I like to think about and sense check my prompts is based on, where would it find the right type of answer on the internet. So if I said I wanted to, I want you to answer this as a data scientist, then it's going to be kind of looking in its brain for articles that mention data science, for comments on Reddit where someone says I'm a data scientist, before they answered the question, and then that's gonna kind of drag it into the right neighborhood or the right kind of location to start answering the question, because obviously there's so many different ways something can be interpreted. If I say write a blog post on mentorship, if I say as a growth marketer, you're going to use completely different anecdotes. You're going to use completely different references. You're going to have a completely different vibe or energy when you're writing that post. Versus if I say talk about mentorship as like a basketball coach, right? So like if you think about all the training data is learned about basketball coaching, it's going to pick up on how they would have talked, and they're just going to try and predict how a basketball coach would have answered that question. Versus a growth marketer, we have our own culture, we have our own way of doing things that will be familiar to other growth mentors. So that's why kind of it's almost like giving an actor their lines. Kind of saying, hey, look, this. What's my motivation for this scene? That's how you kind of need to think about it.
It can backfire sometimes, actually. Again, thinking about the AI data scientist example and the tool that I mentioned, sometimes they would produce these incredibly complex explanations, right? And we were just trying to explain data to marketers, right? So then you had to kind of tweak that. You're an AI data scientist that's talking to marketers unfamiliar with data science, and then the kind of fine tuning that and iterating on it can really change the way that it will respond to you. Or in the content generation example, if you feed it, I want to write this article and these are the focus keywords, and you're an expert content writer, it's going to be able to pick up, how to use keywords or how content marketers should use keywords in their article and be able to kind of put two and two together there.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I think, to me, in my mind, it kind of explains why we sometimes get output that doesn't make any sense. It's like, for example, I think, some of the language sometimes is a little bit bizarre. But if you kind of think about it as, everybody kind of has their own cultural subset depending on your role. Growth marketers kind of have different jargon that they use versus growth product folks versus, regular core product versus, say, sales and all of that. So it'd be interesting to see if it's just a case of the jargon mixing, and if you narrow it down to, okay, this is what I'm used to seeing, do you get output that's more what you expect? And I think that would be a really interesting experiment for us to run. Now, I do want to kind of jump on because I think we've kind of covered a good amount with prompting here that basically I think the examples are a huge help to people. And I think, too, again, that role assignment should be a huge help for narrowing things down. I'm kind of thinking this almost like a pinball machine, sort of. And basically this role assignment and some of this stuff is kind of putting up certain bumpers and putting up certain, obstacles for the pinball to hit and kind of get it to pinging in the right area, I guess.
Yeah, exactly right. It's very iterative. Reminds me a lot of growth hacking, actually, in that you have some hypothesis of what you think would work. You're trying to kind of second guess what behavior would be or what responses would be to the words that you're putting out there. Whether it's copy on landing pages or a prompt in ChatGPT, and then you're A/B testing to see, okay, well, when I do it this way, what type of response do I get? When I do it this way, what type of response do I get? Except I find it a lot more satisfying than I found growth marketing, just because you don't have to wait and you don't have to ask permission. Like ChatGPT responds directly. If you know how to code and you can program it to give you 100 responses, like you can get that done in a few seconds or a few minutes, and then you could literally A/B test, like see, okay, well, when I ask it, when I threaten to take someone hostage, then it does the task 20% better. That's actually a real example. So you can get immediate feedback. Whereas when I was like A/B testing landing pages, A/B testing creatives, you'd have to wait a couple of weeks. So this is much faster, much quicker, but it's using basically the same skills.
One thing I would say here is we did this a lot, and basically what you do have to do is when you're testing, different models, different prompts, one test is never going to be enough. Again, they're not consistent, right? So you're going to want to run 10 tests with one example across different models or different things you want to test, and then kind of average those out. Is because again, you don't have that consistency across with every model, and then you can kind of document that. We ran 15 tests on this model, 15 tests on that model, one with this prompt, another one with that prompt. Sort of has the same sort of scientific method you would use in growth.
Okay, so that actually answers one of my questions, which is, does it make sense to kind of A/B test across models? And it sounds like that's the case.
Yeah, in general, I'd find that some of the models require different prompting strategies. One common example I see is that ChatGPT listens to you more if you put the instructions at the top, whereas Claude from Anthropic listens to you more if you put the instructions at the bottom. Okay. So that's something you can find through A/B testing.
And I guess in general, like trying different things, and it's never going to be one answer. There's no one straightforward way, but sort of having a structure in your prompt is the most important thing. Clearly separating instructions from context, because it just facilitates the model understanding you and be able to be more consistent in that result.
Okay. And I guess what's the best way to do that? Is it best to do it in separate prompts to say, hey, here are your instructions, here's your context, and do those like in two separate, I guess you would say, calls essentially? Or is it best to, add separators within the same prompt? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so I would say probably single prompt would be best, since you're really not adding too many things into the mix. You can obviously, complex tasks can cause models to hallucinate, as we see, or not perform as we need it. So it's better to kind of isolate them. In my mind, what we did is we had different notebooks and different API calls that would run automatically for these tests. So if you can kind of set up that testing environment so you don't actually have to physically do it on the chat interface, that's amazing. Especially if you're trying to run a lot of tests at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah, I think with these sorts of pipelines that you put together to do these tasks, you usually want to have all of the context needed for the task in the same prompt. But then like the actual big task that you're trying to solve could be split into multiple tasks. So if you're trying to write a blog post, you will get pretty bad results if you just say, write me a blog post, here's all the context. But the actual task of writing a blog post isn't just one thing. It's multiple small tasks. You could break it down into those tasks. So you might have one task, which is do the research, where you ask it to go and search Google and find the top ranking article and summarize it, right? So that's a summarization task with search. And then you might take the output of that task, the summary, and say, here's a summary of this topic. Now, can you ask me some questions about the topic in order to get my take. So then that's like kind of an interview task. Then you might ask it, okay, we've got the results of the interview, we've got the summary. So then the next thing is to create an outline for the blog post, and then you have the outline, and then you can take all of that and pass it down further to the next task, which is, okay, now write section 1, write section 2, write section 3. So so you can actually chain all of these different things together, and that's how a lot of apps that are using AI in production are doing it. Like it's very rarely just like one prompt, but like each task has its own context, and it might be the full context of the whole feed, but it might more than likely it's just like the condensed version that the output from the previous task in the chain.
Okay.
I spoke about Delphi AI and how you're able to talk with your data before. So there I mentioned we have multiple steps that it goes through. So somebody might ask, what was my revenue yesterday? So actually one of the first things that we would do is try to classify a question as, is this a subjective question or is this an objective question? Are you asking what my revenue was, or are you asking what revenue is going to be, or why my revenue went down? These are all very different questions. So then we would classify the question, a different set of models would run. And then at the end of it, we would have a final sort of step, which would be reason if this is the appropriate answer, and if not, recommend improvements to it. So in these AI apps, you'll very frequently see there's multiple agents running, which perform different tasks. One might be reasoning for one thing. So this, whatever you're doing in the chat interface, basically, when you're writing a blog article and breaking it down into steps, that's pretty much how the AI applications are built too, only this is obviously happening at scale, and all these steps are connected with one another.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. Now, Alex, I do want to kind of circle back to another point that you mentioned earlier, which is hallucinations, and that point with complexity. Are there, I guess, is it a matter of complexity? And I guess if we're talking about complexity, kind of what can we define that a little bit? What are we referring to as whenever we say it is a quote unquote complex task? But are there certain tasks that make it more prone to hallucinations than others? I mean, I guess if you're depending on something to go search Google, essentially, is it going to be more accurate, or is it going to be more prone to hallucinations? And also, I think another point I wanted to ask is hallucinations the right term? Because I think I've heard a couple of people say, oh, no, we shouldn't be using the term hallucination. I hate that term. So is that the correct term for us to be using whenever we're getting these, essentially what we interpret as errors from our AI?
Technically, the proper term these days is confabulation, because it's confabulation means when someone creates a false story from memory, but it's not. They didn't actually intend to deceive anybody, right? But the AI model is not doing this on purpose. And the reason complexity can feed into this is, obviously, if you have 10, 15 different steps, it might struggle to maintain accuracy. And when it doesn't know what to answer, when it's doing this probabilistic, predicting the next word that its next sentence it should give you, that it would get confused and make up some information. But also it might come down to not having the knowledge. If it doesn't actually know, but you told it that it's supposed to know because he's an AI data scientist, then he might invent some information. I think it really comes down to the right prompt architecture. And then you can really kind of test for these hallucinations, confabulations in the same way that we talked about earlier. So maybe running multiple tests and seeing how accuracy is changing with different runs of it. Also, if you try to, if it's something that's really abstract, for example, and not very specific, again, it might get confused because it's not able to interpret, how to do those things, or it might not have the proper context, or it might not be interpreting the context in the proper way. So this is, I guess, where constant testing comes in to improve. But it's really important, especially for us. When somebody asked what was my revenue yesterday, we had to be sure that we were giving them the right number. If you can't trust your data scientist and data analyst, and who are you going to trust to tell you about your data? So this is a huge consideration, right? So this is why multiple steps in between, and why we would have multiple steps sort of reasoning if this is the right answer, if this is data driven enough, if it's referenced in the right sources, and these checks sort of overall would decrease the inaccuracy.
Yeah, and like ultimately, I mean, hallucination, it's always hallucinating. Like everything it does is a hallucination, right? It doesn't actually know these things, right? It's from memory trying to guess what the most probabilistic answer is. If I ask it, who's the president or whatever, it's going to narrow it down based on the training data it has, but it's still just a guess. Like everything is a guess. We only call it a hallucination when we say it's wrong, right? Other than that, it's also creativity. If I ask it to create an image of Ronald McDonald in space, right? Like that image has never existed before. So the only way it could be creative and make that image is to hallucinate. Right. We obviously label it as a bad thing when it's a factual task, but it's also the reason why these models are so useful in the first place, because they can be creative. They can make up things that are not just a regurgitation of their training data. I would say that the major problem is not necessarily that the models hallucinate; it's that they are too confident when they do. Right. And so if you think about, when you talk to a friend, like maybe one of your coworkers, you ask them what the revenue was yesterday. If they didn't really know, then obviously some of your coworkers might just guess and guess very confidently, right? Like, but that person would be an a-hole, right? Like, they're like, oh, it's 1 million, right? And then you look it up later and you're like, it wasn't 1 million, some people are like that, but most people who are honest, they would say, I think it's 1 million, but I'm not sure. We should check, right? AI doesn't do that. It doesn't express uncertainty. So I suspect that a lot of the solution is not going to be, stopping it from hallucinating, because that is actually like part of what makes them useful. But it's more about getting them to express how certain they are with that answer, and like getting them to express where are they drawing that from? Is it just from memory, or is it from a citation that it looked up? Or did it actually query the database to find this, or did it just make up the most probable answer? So I think that's a lot of the user experience work that needs to go on for anyone building AI applications today, is like getting it to properly express uncertainty when it is just making a best guess.
And we've actually got a couple of great questions here. One's on experimentation that I'll get to in just a second, but the other one that kind of relates to this point that we're discussing is structuring the data that you're feeding it. Essentially, I'm as sure with these examples and things like that. For example, if you've got a CSV file, is it better to give it the entire CSV file as one big file? Is it better to try to find ways to divide up that CSV file? I suppose, maybe I could see you divide it up by, a couple of columns kind of thing. What's the best way to essentially feed the AI the data?
I would say it really depends on the use case. I'm trying to think of just a general principle here, but it depends on what you're trying to do, because, you might want to feed the CSVs as, embeddings, instead of just giving the whole CSV to the chat. So in that case, you'll be able to, in our case, we would write SQL queries based on tables, right? So the table would be converted into a database. And then we would query the database by asking a question. So what was my revenue yesterday? It would go write a query to pull revenue from yesterday based on a table that exists. But that's the use case I have in mind. Probably it makes sense to, I guess multiple things could make sense depending on the use case. But in general, for text analysis, you'd want to have more textual data split into columns rather than numbers. So, for example, for mentor recommendations, we're not going to say this mentor is rated 5 stars or 5-star rating. We're going to say this mentor is rated 5 stars out of this many, which is exceptional out of this many reviews, right? So we'll convert the numbers into natural language so the AI can process them. But that's not always necessary.
Okay. And whenever you're talking about embeddings, I guess what would be the difference between, I suppose, designing, we may be getting a little bit into technical details here, but what would be the difference between designing, say, an embedding versus, just feeding it with examples and feeding it with data? I guess what's kind of the different process for that?
Yeah, embeddings is a different model. So there are embedding models. GPT has embedding models as well. So basically, embeddings will be created based on the data set. And then as a separate step, the result of those embeddings are sent to maybe the top 5 results. So in the case of recommendations, we print the top 5 mentors based, and then feed those to GPT-4 to explain why these mentors are relevant. right? So we're only giving it those top 5 mentors. We're not giving them all the mentors and asking them, find the best fit for this person, because obviously we wouldn't be able to process 800 mentors just through the chat. So in that case, it's a different model, embedding model, and then the chat complete or GPT-4 model.
Yeah, and when you're using a custom GPT with Chat-GPT Plus, when you upload files into one of those, it is doing something in the back end to format the data for you. And a lot of people don't realize this, but if you upload, say, maybe you're making like a HR bot, right, and the bot is supposed to answer employees' questions about what HR policies you have. So you've uploaded the company handbook as a PDF into that custom GPT to give it context. It doesn't have that full book in its memory, right? Like when you ask a question, it makes a decision. Should I look up this in the company handbook? And then if it decides that it should, then it will do a vector search, but it will do it based on a chunk of that document. So it won't, it will say split the document up into paragraphs, for example, and then it will find like maybe one of the paragraphs. So say I ask like, how much vacation time do I get? So it might look up, and maybe there's a paragraph that says like vacation policy, right? And then there's maybe another paragraph that says like additional vacation days based on tenure, right? And then there's like another chunk which is like one of the other paragraphs later on, which is like talking. It says the word vacation, but it's not like actually relevant to the query, right? Like you could it will pull that context in. And obviously you have to hope that it's found like the right 5 things from that big document. And then that's all it has in its memory when it's answering your question. And that's something that's really important for people to know, because when you're building your own AI applications, you need to decide what that chunking strategy is going to be. Like, is a sentence enough? Is a paragraph good? How should you break up tables of data? Like, should you write it into rows? How should you break up pages of PDFs? All of those decisions are things you have to figure out based on your use case. But then the other reason is when you're using a custom GPT, I see people make mistakes like this all the time. They'll say like, can you summarize our company handbook's position on this? And the problem is that like it can only do a search of specific paragraphs, so it doesn't have the whole context of the company book. And people think it does when they uploaded that PDF. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions, I think, with custom GPTs.
Okay, and that's an interesting point. Is there a way that you can kind of get it to, I guess, search more intelligently? Can you tell it, hey, before you summarize this, I need you to search and pull, all the material about anytime you hear vacation days mentioned or something like that, if we're going to use that example? Is there a way to get it to kind of retain the appropriate information?
Yeah, so like one example I've used, so not with custom GPTs, unfortunately, right, because they're designed in a specific rigid way. But like when you're building your own application, you could build whatever you want, and you don't actually necessarily have to know how to code, right? You could use Zapier or one of these no-code tools. But the the way, like, I'll give you a specific example. I had a client where we wanted to summarize all of the different articles that were ranking for a specific keyword, and then take the summaries and then summarize those summaries to get a general idea of like what is the general gist of the search results page. And we're using that for another task afterwards to write some content. At the time, the context window wasn't as big, and we didn't want to waste a bunch of money. So we did this thing called recursive summarization, where it will split all of the articles into chunks, and it will summarize each chunk, and then it would summarize the summaries, and then keep summarizing the summaries until you get like the final summary at the end, right? And so that's an example of like a more intelligent way to handle data. That like you could custom program into your application to solve some of those problems. Like if you're finding that your users are asking specific questions that aren't aren't being answered by traditional RAG. And then if you pair that with a classification step, like Alex was talking about before, like, classify the question first. Are they asking for a summary? And then if they are, then run this other process instead of RAG.
And Alex, anything to add there? Or?
I know. I think he covered it very well. Nothing to add.
Okay, awesome. So I also want to jump back to experiments because we have an audience question about, do you recommend documenting these experiments when you're trying to optimize? And this kind of ties into one of the questions that I had, which is, if you were optimizing on a single model, is it essentially just firing as many prompts as possible? Is there a way is there like a flow chart of logic where you should sit here and say, okay, I tried doing the prompt with the instructions first, and now I'm going to try doing it with the instructions last? Is there a way for people to be smart about their prompting? And their experiments when they're working just with one model?
Yeah, I have a list of 5 prompting principles that actually I wrote them in a blog post a couple of years back, and that was what led to the O'Reilly book, actually. So that's being published next month.
Mm-hmm.
But that's based on those 5 principles. I kind of use it as like a checklist, and I work my way down it. So I'll start with like giving direction to the prompt, like giving it the role, or like telling it what sort of style writing I want, whatever it is. And then I'll kind of work through and say, okay, what format do I want the response to be in? I'll go and find examples, add them to the prompt. That's the 3rd principle. Then I would start testing and evaluating at scale. So running the same prompt 10 times to see if like 1 in 10 times it fails. And then only then would I start to split the prompt up into multiple steps. That's the 5th principle. So I kind of work my way through that checklist over time. And usually I would say like 80 to 90% of the time, it's working by like the 3rd or 4th principle. It doesn't have to be really overcomplicated. But for really important tasks, one of the things that people have started to do recently, if you're particularly technical, there's a library called DSPY, which is like an automatic prompt optimizer, and that will do like the heavy lifting of, it will test your prompt like hundreds of times, and then it will keep like the ones that worked and ditch the ones that didn't work. And so you'll run it, and it'll cost like, some money because it's, calling your prompt hundreds of times. But once you run it, like you'll get like the fully optimized prompt out the other side. And it's using GPT-4 to rewrite your prompt for you. There are like more advanced options like that people are using, but I would say it's still extremely niche, and it's probably not worth doing that unless you're actually going to use your prompt in production. Like, it's actually going to be something that, you deploy on the GrowthMentor website, for example, or, it's something that like a template that is going to be used across hundreds of employees, that sort of thing.
I think that pretty much covers everything. One thing I just want to say, which I also mentioned before, is that it just comes down to that instruction. So is it, write something? Is it classify? Is it summarize? Whatever it is, right? So that has to be very clearly understood by the model and explained in detail what it should be doing, very specific, but not too long, right? Because you don't want it to get confused. And then, of course, you have the context itself, which is the information that you're either feeding it, that it's using to come up with that material, right? Or the example, or the reasoning steps, the way that it should approach solving your problem. And if you kind of test different ways of sort of, again, Mike mentioned before, sometimes it works better to put that at the top or at the bottom. Kind of running these different tests can ultimately get you a better result.
Okay.
But the shorter, usually the better. The simpler you can say the instruction, usually the better result you're going to get. And redundancies often cause hallucinations. I've seen. Okay. So whenever you're telling you to do many different things at once, or make sure you check this and also that, and don't forget this, whenever you get to this complexity, you're going to see it maybe get confused or doesn't work as well.
Okay. And do you guys have a system that you use for documenting these experiments? I guess, is there a certain framework for this, or is it just, you have the, input and output of Chat-GPT essentially that you use and kind of track that way?
Yeah, the simple answer is just Google Sheets, like everything. I operate my business on, I just like dump the answers. Like if I'm running a test locally using Python code in a Jupyter notebook, I'll always just like dump all of the results into a CSV, and then I upload that into Google Sheets, and then I can mess around with it. The more advanced answer is you can use a tool like Langsmith, or weights and biases. There's a bunch of these now. But what they essentially do is piggyback on those calls to OpenAI. So every single time you send a prompt and get a response, it will record that in a database, and then you can go and search that and kind of have a look and click through and see where it's failing, where it's succeeding. So I would say if you're doing any type of prompting, for a production application, you probably need to like get your team onto one of those tools eventually, because then everyone can kind of share the results and annotate them and say, okay, when we run this experiment, we got this sort of result. When we ran that experiment, we got that sort of result. So it's similar to the impact that you'd have from setting up Google Analytics or setting up Mixpanel. Do you have the instrumentation there, and everyone on the team, even if they're not technical, can see the results of the experiments.
And I think I 100% agree there. I think for most people, Google Sheets, like you mentioned, Mike, is the way. Just make sure that you're obviously running it several times for each test that you're running. Again, because one won't necessarily be consistent enough to give you a good result. But yeah, you don't need to necessarily, reinvent the wheel. There's all these sort of very interesting automatic, scalable ways to do it. But if you're just doing this, looking to automate your content writing or something relatively simple, you can just start off with the chat. You can just use Google Sheets and run maybe 10 different tests with different prompts, and then see how it works there. Human sort of, you can judge it as a human, which one you like better, and maybe give it a rating, and then kind of have an average rating for each model, and then decide how you'll optimize.
All right, awesome. So we are hitting the top of the hour now. So Alex, Mike, if you guys have a couple more minutes, I just have one last question for the audience, which is there a good way to practice your prompting skills on things that maybe necessarily aren't the things that you're necessarily building, but you just want to get more, I guess, in practice with these experimentation principles and things like that?
My favorite thing to do is to take a task that a human has done, and then see if I can replicate that task with prompting, and then do a blind test for one of my coworkers and say, okay, which one do you like? Which result do you like? Do you like A or B? And not tell them which one is AI. I would say I have like a 40% success rate with that, in terms of tricking people that with they couldn't guess which one was AI. I actually do that in presentations when I'm doing like company trainings and things like that as well, or speaking at events, because it's just really fun to do. And the big takeaway I've found from doing that is, one, it's actually like pretty easy with just a handful of prompting techniques to automate pretty much any task. And then the second thing that I found is that you're a pretty bad judge of success if you're trying to automate something that you do every day, because you're going to be really harsh on the AI, and you're going to be really generous to yourself, because fundamentally, like, we don't want to be replaced, right? Like, I don't want to believe that the AI can do a better job content writing than me. But when you do that blind test with someone else and get a third-party opinion, that's when you start to really get red-pilled on AI, because you think, oh my God, like, they actually preferred the other version, and they didn't know that wasn't mine, and then that kind of helps you keep your ego in check and realize that, hey, maybe it is, a pretty good idea to automate this with AI. Maybe AI can take this off my hands, and I can then move on to something that AI can't do yet.
Yeah, ultimately, for most people, it should help them be more productive in any way, right? Either automating things or helping them in their day-to-day tasks. And I think just testing as much as you can, and adjusting your prompt, starting a new chat window and trying again, kind of doing that will get you into the rhythm of how it can help you. And very quickly, you'll kind of put pieces of the puzzle together as to how this could scale potentially. And there's so many different tips about how to optimize these models, and especially when it comes to prompting. And there's a lot of sort of interesting reading material out there as well. We just touched on sort of three of the or 3 or 4, right? We talked about zero shot, few shot, chain of thought, and RAG. There's so much out there. We briefly talked about automatic prompt engineer, but there's a lot out there that you can read about and learn, and ultimately build into your workflow if it helps you.
Awesome. Well, I think that is a great note for us to end the session on. Alex, Michael, thank you both so much. And to all of our viewers, thank you all for watching with us today, and have an awesome rest of your day.
All right. Thanks, everyone.